By way of introduction, I could, of course, say that Gustavo Gutierrez needs no introduction at all, and that indeed would be eminently true on this occasion, yet it would not be worthy of our gathering and of the blessing of having Gustavo with us. Or I could simply go down the listing of his groundbreaking books, like A Theology of Liberation of 1973, that launched a movement not only in Latin America but throughout the world. We could focus on his great spiritual classic, We Drink from Our Own Wells, that grounds the spirituality of the praxis of liberation. Or his book on Job, a courageous facing of the ultimate mystery of human suffering in the face of a provident and loving God. And the list of his publications can go on, but you could look them up on Google. I could also simply note that he's a Dominican priest, a member of the Order of Preachers, that he holds the John Cardinal O'Hara Professorship of Theology at the University of Notre Dame and is a member of the Kellogg Institute there, that he's a member of the Peruvian Academy of Languages, a recipient of the Legion of Honor from the French government for, and I'm quoting now, his tireless work for human dignity and against oppression, end of quote. And I could then list his many other honors because this evening's that we confer is only one of many. Instead, I want to highlight for a moment and focus on the genesis of the theology, spirituality, and praxis that has been brought to center stage in our church by Pope Francis. Now, there are many sources of what we are witnessing daily in the pontificate of Pope Francis as he continues to inspire the world with his evangelical values and preferential option for the poor. With Pope Francis is calling the church to imitate the poverty and the praxis of Jesus and to side with those to whom life is most denied. His simplicity of lifestyle, his insistence that the shepherds smell more like the sheep instead of incense, that the church be a field hospital in the battle of life, that it become an inclusive community of hospitality for all, of boundless mercy and compassion for the ones whom Francis names as the throwaways of our society. And of course, here at Boston College, we rightly highlight that his Jesuit charism and spirituality is a prime source of Pope Francis's commitments and faith. But then, how did he get to also be such a Franciscan? And by his good preaching, a Dominican as well, like Gustavo. I propose that Pope Francis and his pontificate comes out of the womb of the Latin American church of the past 50 years, beginning with the poor and pastoral church that was catalyzed by the CELAM conference at Medellin in 1968, where Gustavo was a key advisor and architect. And again, Gustavo helped to reiterate and deepen the CELAM conference at Puebla of 1979, and again with Gustavo's influence that flowered most recently at the CELAM conference of Aparecida. Indeed, Aparecida vividly reflects the from the bottom-up approach to doing theology that Gustavo has long championed and that now marks Pope Francis's pontificate. The theology of liberation, of course, has emerged from the grassroots of the Latin American church. It has been the work of countless hands and hearts, from poor peasants in Las Comunidades de Base and the Theology of the People movement, to many other great scholars and theologians. And yet all would agree that no one has been more influential in shaping the theology of liberation to emerge from the Church of Latin America and now to the world stage with Pope Francis than Gustavo Gutierrez. It is no exaggeration to say that to understand the pontificate of Pope Francis, then look to the work of Gustavo. In September 2013, shortly after his election, Pope Francis invited Gustavo to the Vatican. And L'Osservatore Romano noted at that time, and I quote, "Liberation theology will no longer remain in the shadows to which it has been relegated for some years. And perhaps in the early years there were some misunderstandings and perhaps misstatements on all sides. But now the commitment of liberation theology, and particularly its preferential option for the poor, has moved from the shadows to be a shining light to the whole church and world. Such a miracle, of course, is ultimately the work of the Holy Spirit. But grace most often works through human instruments, and there have never been, and there is none that have been more influential in this regard than Father Gustavo Gutierrez. Would you please join me in welcoming him to Boston College this evening?
Well, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude for this invitation to this university. It's not new for me to be here, and I know very well the house. Yeah. Well, I said very familiar for me to be really in Boston College, and a surprise this evening was to find so many friends, and even very old friends, young persons, but old friends, because I know some of them from their childhood in my country. And I am very happy to be here. Thanks for your reception also. Well, and about the birth of one new theology, new is too much to say. It's the same themes and points, but from other points of view. And do you know how many theologies are in the history of the church? I don't know. But you know, it's many, many. And the big theologies, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, are present until now, and others also. And the other, well, are the theology's reflection very linked to the time and for the questions present in one moment. It is the case of liberation theology also. Some circumstances were present in 50 years ago, more or less. It's very difficult to put dates, you know, in these questions. And I think this theological perspective is the result of, well, three factors, three movements. The first one is historical, and is the new presence of the poor in our world, in humanity. The presence of the poor beginning probably 19th century, a little more 20, and so, but clearly in the middle of 20th century was very strong, was the beginning. One example is, or symbol of this was called the meeting in Bandung, Indonesia. It was a meeting of the poor countries, Asian and African countries, not Latin Americans in the first meeting, but after that several Latin American and Caribbean countries were in the same way incorporated in this. This Bandung was 1956. Was for the interested in intelligent persons, is something very important. For the first time, the poor countries, for this reason, their association in one moment was the expression also the third world, because not capitalist, not a communist, it was the idea, and a third world. Today we have only two, because in Latin America is part of the second world. It's the only one promotion in so many years, because third to two. But the situation is not the same, but it's always difficult. Well, and I remember in the council, Elder Camara, you know this name, the Archbishop of Recife, a great personality. In one moment, he was speaking about we need a Christian Bandung. One manner to speak, but was very present in many other things about this. And we have also the decolonization of so many countries, Asia, Africa, Caribbean also, in Latin America, or at least in this continent, and new presence in different manners, ways. It is not a question only in our continent, in Latin America and the Caribbean, but was present also in the world, in other countries. You know this in this country, who is the black movement and black theology, more or less in the same dates, and or the movement of women, the other expressions, and I don't pretend this take too much time. I don't pretend to detail this, but certainly it was present in the world, above all in the poor countries, and in the minorities, the case of Blake, the black people. Well, and we call this in Latin America also, we have called this the eruption of the poor. The poor was so present, and because historically they were absent of history, absent. And they were there physically, but they were not subjects of their destiny. For example, even today, are not fully, at least. Well, this eruption of the poor, this is an ongoing process. It's not finished. It has started more or less in the first part of the 20th century, above all in the second part of the 20th century, even more and more. We have today other expressions of the presence of the marginalized people. And well, this movement put several questions to the announce of the gospel. This question is not only political or social. Our vision of this situation, new situation, was to say we need to reflect about the Christian message. This is theology. Theology, we are going to the sources in order to answer the fights, the challenges. This is the case. And well, it was very important even today. Even today, we have, and to avoid one abstract manner to see this fact, we have tried to be sensitive and close to this. persons are in this speaking about this, they is new, they are asking for the rights. Well, this position is the expression of suffering. Suffering because poverty in the last manner is this. Is this, the people are living in the terrible conditions. And this challenge, this eruption for the poor, was for several persons in Latin America, theologians and pastors, very ecumenical, from the beginning. This theology was born with the work of Catholics and evangelical Protestant theologians also. In several meetings, the idea in these meetings was not to create a new theology, but to discuss about this situation. I remember very well these questions, these meetings, and so on. Well, I think suffering was present. We must, our interest is not for poverty, but for the poor. As the Bible. The Bible is not speaking about poverty, a little bit, but it's speaking about the poor, persons. Well, I think this line, this perspective was very, very important, and changing also the notion of poverty. This point is very important because it's not only to be challenged by the fact of this new presence, but at the same time, poverty was present in more or less in a different manner. Even today, for many persons, poverty is a social issue, not human. Is it a human issue? It's a theological question. Poverty. Poverty is not only economic question. No, it is not so. Because the life of persons, the suffering of persons, the early death of persons is very relevant. Well, and I would like to indicate, at least to be brief in this point, also 2 points in this new perception of poverty. One is poverty is a complex fact. It's not only a monetary poverty. Even for today, for many persons, it's the question of money. It's the question of $1.15 is good, is extreme poverty, is poverty. Well, it's not the case in the Bible. It is not the case for Christians, and not for liberation theology. From the very beginning, the first text, the late 60s, the first years of 70s, this question is present there. It's complex. What is the meaning of complex? Well, complex because it's not only economic. Poverty is not only a question of economy. It is economic question also, certainly. It's one aspect. But at the same time, it's a complex reality. And it's a question of culture, for example. In the first writings, we were speaking about cultures, above all, from the intercultural countries as Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, we have different cultures there. At the same time, many similarities, but the difference also. The Quechua people is millions of persons, you know, the persons speaking Quechua in Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru. Well, and I think they were despised cultures. For the other, in the center of the country of Western mentality, and it is one aspect of poverty. Another is racial, linked to culture, but racial also. The Latin American people don't like to say, to accept we are racist peoples also. I regret that we are racist because I see this in my country and in my family, and as consequence about this family, mestizo family. Well, and another question is the gender question also, the sexual orientation of people. You know, this philosopher Hannah Arendt has said a very short sentence, one expression about the poor. The poor, according to her, the poor is a person has not the right to have rights. It is the poor, without rights. Well, without rights is not money. It's to be accepted, to be, and for the reason I say it's complex, very complex. First point, you know, it is not later. Sometimes this, after you are speaking, no. I have the text. I can say this in the verse was the question of race, culture, and quickly, explicitly was present also, but more explicitly the question of women as not rights also. We know this. And I know we have many changes and some progress. It is true, but no, it's not enough. All this is poverty. You know, it's for the reason I say new perception, because even today is new for many persons. At the other point, there are many others, but the second is another very complex, very difficult also. And the reason of many difficulties for us in liberation theology is this: poverty is the result of human causes, reasons. We have made poverty. And for a long time in humanity, in the church or outside of the church also, poverty was a fact. It's a fact. A destiny is not so. Poverty is not a destiny, it's an injustice. This is. And this injustice is theological, because justice is a central point in the Bible. Central point. First Testament and Second Testament, justice is always there. Even in the Second Testament and the First Testament, all the time. Well, I think causes, for what reason I have said many difficulties from this, because people don't like to say you are a cause of poverty. And in this case they say, no, this is not Christian. I am a very good person helping the poor. Good is very important, but it's not enough. we cannot stop the condition, the situation of poverty, only helping the poor, but changing structures. And it is said very clearly by John Paul II, very clearly. And the conflict also, number 11 of the encyclical about the work, the Pope says the big conflict today, today is the conflict between the capital and the work. And in addition, he says it is not only abstract questions. There are persons among capital and persons in labor. Well, this is the question. And you know, many of our difficulties were coming from this point. Even for the first one, for the point of the poverty is a complex question, because speaking about racism and so is very complicated. And well, I would like to finish with this first point. We need to know the realities, and for this reason, we have employed in theology social science. The social science were not so present at that time, a little bit always. But today in theology, full social science. To read the Bible, for example, full. But 50 years ago, strange. Social science is this communism. And well, but how to read a social situation without social science? Not because they are the last word, but it's only a contribution. Philosophy was never the last word in theology, but was very necessary to employ philosophical notions in order to do theology. Well, but to finish this point, I say the question of suffering is always present, always present. I say this because I would like to take this point after. Second line, in the 60s also, Vatican II. Vatican II is the other. Without Vatican II, we have not liberation theology. Because we have, above all, the person of John the 23rd. John the 23rd, to imitate the question to only 2 points, 2 contributions. One, about the church. Facing the underdeveloped countries, the church is and want to be the church of anyone, and especially the church of the poor. It was this sentence, very short sentence, but very, very important. From the Pope, we have this call to this. And, well, trying to deepen the meaning of this, the consequences, and so was very helpful for one reflection. The second point has also a great presence in theology, in liberation theology, but not only, but in general or, as well. Well, is the question of the reading the signs of the times. It is pay attention to history, because persons subjects of Christian life, they are in history. We are there. And it's one consequence of our affirmation, the incarnation, the Son of God, made one of the human history. Well, it is very important. History is very important, even from the Christian message. And to pay attention to the signs of the times, the expression is coming from one text in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, 16, 2 and 3 verse. And it is there. And John the 23rd take this perspective. Well, very discussed in the council, and you can take in Gaudium et Spes, number 4, 11, yeah, there are another later, I don't know, 14, 3, I don't remember in this moment. Mentions of the signs of the times. You know, it's very difficult to do that, but it's necessary. And more or less, my presentation of the Fairline was trying to do a reading of the signs of the times. And the signs of the times not are all of them positive. Very bad facts are a sign of the times. Poverty, for example, is a sign of the time, but not good. It's not a sign of the time, beautiful. No, it's not beautiful. It's only challenge the Christians living in history. These two contributions are very important. You know, in liberation theology, we present theology as a critical reflection about the practice of persons, especially Christians. And well, certainly we have a great debt with this affirmation about the signs of the times, but also about the question of the poor are first, and must be first in our concern. The third one is different, very personal also. For me, it comes from my time as a student. I was a student in theology in Lyon, in France, coming from Louvain, where I was studying philosophy and psychology, and but I was very interested in psychology because my first intention was to become a psychiatrist, and I was doing some years medical studies for this. But you know, reading theology is more important, certainly for me. In Lyon was my first year. I was working very much there. You know, curiously, in one moment, I say, but this is beautiful, but for what reason? We are doing theology. What is the reason? It's beautiful, certainly, but at the same time, during this year, first year, in my readings, I have seen several quotations of one French theologian, Dominican, called Marie-Dominique Chenu. And I say, this is very interesting, really. The quotations better than the book. And I say, I would like to read Chenu. But you know, this book were in the index, book of Chenu. Not today, you know. But I was to my superior, the seminary, the Sulpician. I say, Father, I would like to read this book. Because for what reason? It seems very interesting. And I say, well, he told me I need to ask this to the Cardinal, Archevêque of Lyon. I am not sure he was going to the Cardinal, but I don't know. But well, and 1 week or 2 weeks, I don't remember, he had this book in his own library. He gave me this book. This book is this, very simple, very simple. For this reason, it's so good. The name of the book is Le Solchoir. Le Solchoir was the theological studio of the Dominicans. Le Solchoir, the manner to do, the way to do theology, to teach theology in Le Solchoir. Well, and it is a book. Well, I am not speaking about the whole book. It's very small. It's a very small book. But I can at least to underline this question. And Chenu says there, it is a bad question to ask which is the theology behind this spirituality. This is wrong. The true question is, who is the spirituality behind this theology? You know, for me it was a light. Sorry, but for me it was a light. Because I was impressed, fascinated by my readings in theology, very young person also, but not so. Not. I have 27 years when I was in the first year in theology. Well, but and put examples. If we want to understand Thomas Aquinas, we must go to Dominic. If we want to understand Bonaventure, we must go to Francis. You know, very simple. Very simple. It has changed. Right? And spirituality, that is to say, the word take in the place of following Jesus. Spirituality was born in France in late 17th century, 18. And well, spirituality is this, is to follow Jesus. In classic Latin expression, is this, it is the question. Well, and for what reason was really a personal light? Because I was very interested always, as a lay person also, in what is called spirituality, and certainly spirituality helps to put theology in his place. Theology is not first. It's the intellectual, this is important, and theology applied. No? And what you know, the system of teaching theology was more or less this. Some years in learning theology and go to pastoral to apply the notions. But it is very Greek, this question. And it is not really no, it's not so. It's the doctrine, the terms, but the other perspective is not exactly the contrary, you know, but is one point to insist between the relation between spirituality. Spirituality is practice. Spirituality is one manner to do. This is spirituality. To pray, this is practice. And to do something for other person, it is practice also. It's a spirituality. Spirituality is not only to pray. It's not only contemplation. The love for loving the neighbor is one manner. It is a spirituality. It's concretely well, and in this case, and trying to take into account my 2 points, the presence until now, the presence of the poor, and we are discovering more and more and more in this question, and the inspiration of the council in Medellin. Tom has presented, mentioned the question of Medellin. This inspiration is very important in order to do theology. And for in liberation theology, the question of spirituality is central, because it's central in the Christian message. And you know, if you take the Bible, at least I have not found, go in the world and you make doing theology to announce the gospel. It's not so, you know. In the end of Matthew is only in the world to make disciples of persons. Well, and again, it's very simple, but it's very important also. The theology is really very linked to spirituality. But spirituality is a practice, and practice in history. Because the manner to be a Christian, the way to be a Christian today is not concretely, is not the same of 5 centuries ago. Certainly, follow Jesus is the same. Charity, the word, is the same also. But the manner, well, I think we must understand this, and in this moment was very, for me personally, very interesting to have this manner to understand theology. For the reason we say theology is a second act, it's not the first. The first act is to be Christian. This is the first act of theology. Second, not secondary, no, but second comes after. After practice. But I have said in one moment quickly the relation between these 2 questions. Certainly, theology is a reflection, and spirituality is a practice. But the question is not, in the past, theology was more important. Now, more important spirituality. No, it's not my case. I think what's more important is to have close these 2 questions. You know, because we are always one person, and other souvenirs were important for me from my medical studies. I have remembered one professor, very good professor, a professor of physiology, and nothing to do with theology. For him, for me, yes. He has said in one moment, you know, nothing is more practical than a good theory. Good. Because, you know, good practice, good theory, good. Very bad theory is not good. But it's practical. It's practical. In medicine, it's very clear. You need to know the human body, the anatomy, terrible course. To learn in the beginning by heart all the questions, but we need to know the body, otherwise. And well, in this case, practice and theory, practice and reflection and theory, and it is not exactly to go from a deductive manner to reflect to inductive, but trying to do this together, because the reflection is important. It's very important. And I think this is, for me, this question, nothing to do initially with theology, this question of theory and practice, but was my question. Well, but now, to finish, I must take some general points. One is I have, I would like to repeat my point. These three questions are around persons. Persons. It's the practice of the persons. And, well, and we cannot forget this. You know, the abstraction in some theologies, even today, also, well, it's terrible, I think. We are, if we take seriously the question of the Church of the Poor or the expression of Francis, the Church poor and for the poor, is exactly the question of John the 23rd, but a little more precise maybe. But it is to be Christian, to belong to a Christian community, is to be in the service of other persons. It is the question. And theology is very interesting intellectually, at least for me. But it's not my reason. And the reason to do theology is to try to help persons and the church to do a good service, a faithful service to the persons also. It is the question. In Thomas Aquinas, in his first moment, in the beginning of the Summa Theologica, has this question. Theology is also a practical science, and they say yes, also. Practical also. It's very intellectual, certainly, and at the same time, practical. And you know, this question was very present in the Synod, the question of doctrine and pastoral, very present. It is not the old questions, no, present. And pastoral is persons, you know. A pastoral is addressed to persons. And well, we need to be serious, theologically speaking, to do serious reflections, and with historical sources, above all, Bible. Bible is a manner to go to the source. I am always interested in to find the biblical sources in order to, because this is new. We have different readings sometimes, not in contradiction, but different in accents and the readings of the Bible. Well, one point, persons. The second point, theology in this case. Personally, and really I think many other persons are thinking in the same way, is one hermeneutic of hope. To reflect is to propose we have hope. And the reflection, among the three virtues, faith, hope, and charity, well, the second one is very important in theology. It is possible to have hope. I remember always, for my background in France, I was reading one great poet, the first part of 20th century, Charles Péguy. He has one book about hope. And his idea is this. They are three sisters, two bigs, faith and charity. In the middle, hope, very, very small. And the three, the hands, people, says Charles Péguy, think the great sisters are trying, not so, the small, the girl, it is taking charity and faith to walk. I think it's interesting. And immediately I have recalled this question, and my manner to understand in this moment theology is this. I think is one hermeneutic is interpretation. Interpretation of hope. It's possible to have hope today. Well, it is the task. We need to deepen notions, faith, the possibilities of charity, but it is the question. Well, my friends, it is, yeah, but I can stop here because I have another moment.